Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience, I want to welcome you to Wild Visionary, a conversation on Maurice Sendak to celebrate the book release of Golan Moskowitz's Wild Visionary, Maurice Sendak in Queer Jewish Context. I'm Michael Cohen, the Stuart and Suzanne Grant Professor of the American Jewish Experience and Director of the Grant Center, which empowers innovative research and collaborations within and beyond the Academy to advance American Jewish studies and explore its broader relevance. Despite the pandemic, we've brought together virtually over 50 scholars from over 30 institutions around the world in this academic year alone. Enrollment in Tulane Jewish Studies courses has more than doubled since the launch of the center a year ago, over and above our already nationally recognized student enrollments. And our public programming has adapted to a virtual platform, and it is in this context that I welcome you to today's exciting and innovative event. I want to introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Gregory Maguire is the author of Wicked, on which the award-winning Broadway musical is based, along with several dozen crossover books for adults and children. Brian Selznick is author and illustrator of many books for children, including The Invention of Hugo Cabret, winner of the Caldecott Medal and the basis for the Oscar-winning movie Hugo. Dr. Golan Moskowitz, assistant professor of Jewish studies at Tulane University, whose new book on Maurice Sendak's life and work in queer Jewish context was published by Stanford University Press. And our moderator today is Dr. Mara Gubar, Associate Professor of Literature at MIT and author of Artful Dodgers, Reconceiving the Golden Age of Children's Literature. Just to give you a brief overview of the webinar today, we'll begin today by asking our three panelists to share their connections to Sendak and impact on their work. Professor Moskowitz will then read a short excerpt from his book, Wild Visionary, and Dr. Gubar will then moderate a question and answer session with all of you. And I just ask you to put questions as you have them, just type them into the chat window. And so I will pass it on to Mara Gubar.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for joining us here today to celebrate the publication of Golan's wonderful book. And from this book, I learned that Sendak once said, "The question I am obsessed with is how do children survive?" And Golan's book really illuminated for me why this was such a pressing question for him by sort of giving us an account of how this focus on survival stemmed from Sendak's own personal experience, growing up as both a queer child in a ruthlessly heteronormative culture and a Jewish child growing up as the horrors of the Holocaust unfolded. As a child of grieving immigrant parents who had lost many loved ones. So before I ask our panelists to share their personal connections to Sendak and his work, I just want to say how accurately I feel like Golan has captured the Jewish part of this story, which in many ways is my family's story too. My grandmother, Louise David, she was forced to flee Nazi Germany. And she arrived in Staten Island in 1938 by herself with a baby. I think of all the pictures of babies of lost Jewish people that Sendak sort of put into his work that Golan tells us about. She arrived with her very much alive baby, hoping her husband would get out later, which he did by the skin of his teeth. And if they hadn't made it out, then I would not be here today. So I'm just so grateful to writers like Golan who commemorate this part of the Jewish experience. And I wanted to share with you that my grandmother herself did that too, in her own way. She was no professional writer, but she went late in her life to Hunter College and took a writing class and wrote this enormous family history that she self-published of our family. And I'm sharing this with you because of its title, which was How We Survived. So a kind of a link there with Sendak. So I just wanted to commemorate her alongside of everyone else, all the other survivors we'll be talking about today. And so I think with that, I will just turn it over to writers who are going to, I think, give us a part of some insight on a happier side of Sendak's story, which is his wonderful chosen family, his close relationships with other writers that Golan talks about so beautifully in his book. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Brian to talk about his relation with Sendak.
Thank you so much, Mara, and congratulations to Golan on the publication of this really fantastic book. And thank you to everyone at Tulane and everyone for making this possible. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation. I met Maurice at a children's book event. I think when I had published a book called The Doll People, and I was so nervous about meeting him that I couldn't really talk. And so I asked his assistant if I could have his address, because I thought I could get my thoughts together better if I wrote. And so I wrote him a letter, and a little while after that, I got a phone call. He had gotten my phone number, and we started having these incredible late night phone conversations about life and art. And I had just finished a children's book about Walt Whitman. And he, for the first time in his life, had begun reading Walt Whitman. He talked about how he had avoided Walt Whitman for his whole life. And this actually tracks in an interesting way with the way that Golan has looked at Maurice's work through his Jewish side and his queer side. And of course, he was very public throughout his life about his Jewishness. And for most of his life, he was not public about his queerness. And Maurice told me that the reason he never read Whitman was he could not believe that someone who lived in the 19th century could possibly be as comfortable as Whitman seemed to be about his queerness, when Maurice, throughout his life was not comfortable. So he just did not believe that Whitman could possibly have been that comfortably queer. And whatever Whitman was actually feeling at the time, we of course don't know. But when I met Sendak, he finally was out very publicly. He talked about his queerness very publicly, and he had finally turned to Whitman. And he didn't know my work at all. Maurice didn't know my work. So he asked me to send him some of my books. So I boxed up a bunch of books, sent it along to him. And a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call, and he said, "Well, I guess you want to know what I think of your work." And I said, "Yeah, that would be that would be great." And he said, "Well, you can draw," which isn't true of most illustrators, but none of these books live up to the potential that I see in you. And he particularly pointed out the Whitman book that I had done, and pointed out what he thought didn't work about the book. But he did it in a way that, even if at the time I didn't exactly know what he meant, I knew that it was a great show of support and respect to be that critical in such a clear and in a way that he was obviously trying to be very, very helpful to me. And ultimately what he said to me was, "You've got to make the book you want to make." And I went off, and by this point I was going up to his house every, whenever I could, to go visit him in person, and we would go walk through the woods with his dog. And the one idea that I had had in the back of my head for many years was to write a story about a kid who meets the French filmmaker Georges Méliès, who made the trip to the moon. And so that was the book I made. And when I finished The Invention of Hugo Cabret, I sent it to Maurice. And a little while after that, we had scheduled a visit for me to go to his house. And we went for a walk through the woods. And he said, "Brian, well, I read The Invention of Hugo Cabret," and I kind of braced myself. And he said, "This is the book I was waiting for." And so that, as you can imagine, meant everything to me. And our relationship, I loved him so deeply, and I learned so much from him. He told me about a sequence of secret poems that Walt Whitman wrote that I didn't know about, 12 queer poems about this love affair with another man that Whitman was thinking of, that Maurice was thinking of illustrating. And when Whitman, I keep calling Maurice Whitman and vice versa, because they occupy the same place in a part of my mind. And ultimately, Maurice did not illustrate those poems, but it inspired me to illustrate it. And we could talk more about that later. But that book, Live Oak with Moss, is dedicated to Maurice Sendak. And I was really honored when I saw that Golan had mentioned it in Wild Visionary. So I will now hand things over. I believe I'm handing them over to Gregory now. And so I will hand things over to Gregory. Thank you, and hi, Gregory.
Hi, Brian. From far away, Brian, and hello, everybody. Thank you as well as to Golan and to Mara and everyone who has invited us here and worked to make this thing happen through the technological wizardry of what this year has brought us. I think that when asked the question, how did you come to know Maurice? What was your personal experience of him, which is where we start? I think I'd have to point to two separate trajectories. One trajectory is the trajectory of the child reader, because Maurice is just older enough than me that his books were in the library at the time that I was able to go look at the picture book shelves and pick my books for myself. I was not, my experience is not as a child of Jewish immigrants, but one of my parents was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, a very poor Greek Orthodox immigrant. And I think there are a lot of similarities between the peasants coming from Eastern Europe at the beginning part of the 20th century and those coming from Northern Eastern Europe. So I felt a kind of simpatico with some of the early pictures that I saw that Sendak drew, in part because his kids were all squat and dark-haired, and they weren't blonde like Jack and Judy and John, Jean, and Jill and all the people in the primers. They didn't look Ozzie and Harriet-ish to me. They looked like us. They looked like the Maguires with our Greek side and our Irish side. And I felt at home. One, in early reading, and I'm a children's literature advocate as much as anything else in my professional life, in early reading, I think all children peering at the pages of an open book are looking to find suggestions of who they might be. They haven't settled down yet into who they are. We never really do settle down, but we are intrigued by the possibilities of who we might be. And the younger we are, the more innocent, the more open and mysterious is the world, the more those images have significance to us, I think. They have totemic power, and they have therapeutic power too, I might add. Not that everything is a crisis to be survived, but by election, we align ourselves with those in books who speak to us, who seem like, oh, if they only were here, we would be great friends. So I actually carried down from upstairs just a couple of books that I can't swear that I saw these when I was 5 or 6, but I can think it's quite possible. And I'm picking out pages that have drawings of boys who were friends with each other. Before the age of 7, boys can be friends with each other without anybody raising an eyebrow. Indeed, for somebody who was the middle of 5 brothers and 2 sisters, I was friends with everybody. You know, it wasn't that hard. But books like this, with the boys in Jana Sudri's book coming to their closing picture in their adventures, just about holding hands, certainly having got through the little travail of the moment to decide that to be together and to be collaborative was safer for them than to be apart. I looked at this book from I'll Be You and You Be Me by Ruth Krauss. I'm sorry about the light and the glare on the screen here. And I just opened up to a sample page about half an hour ago thinking, what am I talking about, Gregory? Come on, decide what you're talking about. I'm going to read the poem and then I'm going to show you the pictures. The poem is 4 lines. Skippy skipped over the rocks. Hoppy hopped over the rocks. Together, they both jumped over the world. And there is the picture. Together, they both jumped over the world. That picture is also included in the end. And isn't this the kind of paradise lost that we are looking for when we are first diving into books and seeing, can we breathe here? is there life? Is there nourishment? Is there possibility for me here? On the opposite page, I just noticed, again, it might be the same two boys. You take your name, you take my name, and I'll take yours. That's kind of Sendak's early Andre Aciman, call me by your name. There are other examples. I'll only show one more. And this is the last page of Janice May Udry's The Moon Jumpers, where the children who have been cavorting in a moonlight paradise are now going to bed. And somehow it was not lost on me that the two boys are in the same bed. I'm not saying that I was particularly sexualized as a young child. In fact, I don't think I really kind of understood how it all worked until I was about 36. But I can say that I found myself warmly welcomed into these early pages, even before I was able to begin to identify the name of an artist, or before I was began to be able to amass the body of appreciation that meant, oh, this is somebody that you like. So I had amassed that body of admiration. I had loved particularly Higgledy-Piggledy Pop when I was sort of in late high school. It was kind of the trippy book for kids who weren't brave enough to go on drugs. And it had a lot of overtones of Alice in Wonderland, and I was and would become a fantasist. So those books meant a great deal to me. But then in 1977, when I was 22 or 23, I moved to Boston in order to attend a conference in children's literature at which Sendak was one of the main speakers. He was about 46 at the time, I believe, or 48, I forget. And I was a new graduate student at the Center for the Study of Children's Literature, which had just opened its doors to graduate students. I was invited to join him and 8 or 10 other new graduate students on a rooftop at Simmons College in Boston for a deli dinner. And I got sat next to him. I don't think I pushed anybody over the parapet so that I could get that chair, but it was either luck or the director of the program had seen something in me and thought this makes sense, and maybe I had been placed there. I don't remember. But like Brian, I was terrified, wanting to be deemed worthy of attention, but at the same time tongue-tied and almost unable to speak. I finally said something that wasn't very funny, and he laughed. He threw back his head and laughed, and I thought, oh, I've just made it, like through the first challenge. Somehow I've made this man laugh. And we were friends basically ever since that first laugh, ever since the first day we met. Like Brian, I wrote to him. He called me up the way he called Brian up, and he invited me down for a visit, and I began a lifelong tradition of visiting him in Connecticut as well. Perhaps I didn't go as often as Brian because I didn't live as near, and also eventually I lived in Europe for quite some time. Our friendship came and went over the course of 35 years, I think it was, but unlike a lot of friendships with Maurice, about which I've heard, ours never sort of fell apart. I think I've heard that a lot of them do, and or did, but ours never did, possibly because I was careful to try not to seem too needy, although needy did, I feel, yes. In the last 15 years of his life, I would say we kicked up a notch to where there was more than just experience. He finally saw that I had grown up and I had actually developed a brain, and my communication, my conversation was worth listening to, and it was terrific. He has been a muse to me, perhaps the only person I've known personally that I consider a real genius. And whenever I am in the dumps about my creative work, which is fairly often, the greatest antidote to despair is to go and stand in front of the bookshelf where I have almost a complete locked bookcase of Sendak's works. Not valuable editions, but just the pictures and the books, the things he cared to work on. And they inspire me by his dedication, his zeal, his unending persistence. And that's where I will leave it and pass the baton on to the next person.
Thank you so much for those valuable reflections, Gregory and Brian. It's such an honor to have this book launch and conversation with the two of you, such distinguished creative figures who are also dear friends of Sendak's, and I love the memories that you shared. I also am so fortunate to have a moderator like Mara Gubar. Thank you so much for the careful investment that you showed in reading the book so carefully ahead of time and offering your own reflections. Your work in children's literature has been formative for me, so it's really an honor to have you moderating this conversation. I want to thank Tulane and the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience, where I'm based now, for enabling this event, everyone on the back end, all the work you've put in. And thank you to everyone who's in attendance today. It's such a pleasure to have so many participants and company in this book launch. So I want to just introduce my book real briefly, and then I'll read a few pages, a few passages. This, as you know, is my first book, and it looks at Maurice Sendak's life and work through the lenses of queer studies, Jewish studies, and their intersections. I'm so happy to share this labor of love and this labor of many years of research, writing, and revising. My interest in the world of Maurice Sendak, like many of you, I would imagine, began at an early age. Sendak touched my own life as a young person who found, as Gregory shared, and I think Brian as well, seemingly banished or denigrated parts of himself addressed in the spaces of the wild things and other Sendakian realms of expressive catharsis and emotional bravery through fantasy. My interest in Sendak also drew on academic interests I cultivated in graduate school around visual arts and popular culture, trauma studies, intergenerational memory, gender and sexuality studies, and childhood. So Sendak's world and the creative vision that he cultivated and achieved, I think really spoke to a lot of facets of where I came from in approaching this work. So I'll take the next few minutes to read to you from my book, and to keep things concise and hopefully more interesting, I'm not going to read from the physical copy itself, but rather draw from a few excerpts that I've assembled on screen, a few different passages. As much as I do love showing off the book itself, which was designed by Kevin Barrett Kane, and I want to show you here with this beautiful wraparound image here of Sendak holding the Nutcracker set design. Okay, so here we go. I don't like all kids, the late Maurice Sendak once famously declared. Some of them are as awful as their parents. Very young people, he believed, are not categorically all alike. He rejected the Enlightenment-based notion that children are blank slates, shapeable matter. Ideals of childhood innocence, he felt, reflected adults' demands that children not know, not feel, but instead primarily behave, submitting to dictation from an exclusionary society. Children, the artist asserted, were tragically socialized out of the fierce honesty and emotional transparency with which they are born and which few adults manage to maintain. During his own early years, Sendak occupied an ethereal, self-constituted realm between his Yiddish-speaking immigrant parents' old world memories, his own wild fantasies inspired by the American popular arts, and the laws of an establishment culture he perceived as vapid, assimilatory, sometimes even dangerous. Disillusioned by school and social surroundings in the 30s through the 1950s, he thrived instead on the gruesome and sensual thrills of folklore, family memory, mass culture, and on romantic sensibilities that envisioned young people as primal vessels of nature, rather than pliable citizens in the making. In their sensitivity to emotional possibilities forgotten or ignored, Sendak's protagonists blur the line between childhood and adulthood, perceiving harmonies and connections that surprise, comfort, or challenge. Like artists, they follow emotional and physiological rhythms that expose the limits of socially constructed boundaries and modes of being. One of Sendak's most remembered childhood experiences was viewing The Wizard of Oz, MGM's The Wizard of Oz, on screen in 1939. So I'm going to read a passage about that experience and how that informed his work. Sendak viewed The Wizard of Oz likely within weeks of Germany's invasion of Poland, where most of his relatives were killed by the Nazis not long afterwards. Two particular moments in the film initially caused him to cry and scream so much, he would claim, that he was escorted out of the theater. In the first scene, Dorothy Gale, captured by the Wicked Witch, sees her distraught Auntie Em in Kansas crying out to her from within the witch's crystal ball. Dorothy, even more desperate, calls back in tears, "Auntie Em, here I am," but Auntie M can neither see nor hear her. Second was the scene in which Dorothy awakens in her bed in Kansas. None of the adults care to listen to her dream about Oz, focusing only on the fact that she is alive, having emerged from her trance, having returned to their version of reality. At the film's end, Dorothy is still in some respects as far away from her caretakers as she was when calling to them through the witch's crystal ball. Sendak would assert that these scenes flooded his work and broke his heart because Dorothy and Auntie M were presented in the same physical space of the film, yet still unable to reach each other. This dynamic mirrored his own feelings as a child who, despite his investment in his parents' stories, sometimes felt so emotionally distant from them that he was forced to fend for himself, sometimes even within their own company. And of course, this speaks to his difference as a queer person, as well as a first-generation American. Sendak was doubly struck by the tragedy of Dorothy's happy ending, which conveyed how adults miss important pieces of their children's lives, even life-changing pieces. Children must learn that their intensely felt and imagined experiences are theirs alone, and no parent or aunt or uncle can save them from or fully share with them in their own life-altering fantasies. All it takes is one moment of neglectful distraction in Sendak's Outside Over There, for example, for the infant to find herself in the clutches of goblin intruders, whom the artist draws like the guards of the Wicked Witch's castle from the MGM film, marching solemnly as hooded figures. Ida ultimately melts those goblins into a dancing stream, as Dorothy does to the evil witch with a pail of water. Ida's blue dress is also an homage to Dorothy's, and her act of stretching a yellow cloak across the sky at the start of her frightening journey draws from the symbolic yellow brick road. In one of his page spreads, Sendak even mirrors the composition of the traumatic scene from Wizard of Oz. Ida hovers above her distraught mother, who appears in a globe-like section of the bottom of the page, as though trapped in a crystal ball. Some of Sendak's most powerful works would depict moments in which a child and parent are, like Dorothy and Auntie M in the crystal ball, physically proximal but emotionally worlds apart. This next passage is about Sendak's experience graduating high school and taking his own kind of momentous flight from his parents in Brooklyn to his beginning in Manhattan. Sendak lived for a while in a first-floor studio at 10th Avenue and 49th Street, in the center of what George Chauncey described as a poor gay enclave. Large groups of gay youth crowded into Hell's Kitchen's tenements. Hell's Kitchen may have served as Sendak's very own night kitchen, decades before he finalized his story of central awakening in the night kitchen in the summer of 1969. And I have that actually right here, kind of old beat-up copy. And this is, of course, the same summer in which we see these Stonewall riots break out, catalyzing the gay liberation movement just blocks away from Sendak's studio as he composed this work. By the time of Night Kitchen, Sendak had really become a fixture of cultural life in Greenwich Village, where he found himself brushing shoulders with all sorts of creative icons and celebrities. At one cocktail party in the village, he would find himself utterly speechless when making the acquaintance of one particular woman who turned out to be none other than Margaret Hamilton herself, known for her role as the Wicked Witch of the West in MGM's The Wizard of Oz. And as the story goes, he was so nervous he almost spilled his drink on her, kind of likening himself to Dorothy with her pail of water. As a public figure by the late 20th century, Sendak would have experienced firsthand the tensions of belonging too well in some respects to take his difference as a Jewish person and a queer person for granted. Young children continued to inspire him and his creativity. Children were beings inherently positioned between inside and outside spaces, spaces of belonging and isolation. Children were masters at juggling these multiple registers of reality through fantasy. The worlds that Sendak came to straddle, including New York's stigmatized and wildly creative gay subculture, the rapidly expanding but conservatively critiqued field of children's literature, and the tight-knit atmosphere of his suffering immigrant family, were in some respects impossibly far apart from each other. His experience of emotional overextension and social incoherence demanded unrestrained bouts of fantasy, release, invention. Playing in this way, he made work that appealed to young children who learned to function socially by trusting their urgent, if sometimes unclear, emotions, testing out different performances, roles, and disguises, while orienting themselves toward external powers and new possibilities, not always fully clear to them. Guided by these strong internal currents, Sendak applied his perspectives to the space of childhood, seeing children as kindred spirits. Children were, like himself, human beings on the edge of the world. And I think that last sentence really speaks nicely with that last image that Gregory showed us of Skippy and Hoppy, two boys holding hands, jumping over the world, kind of inventing their own possibilities beyond normative constraints and structures. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it back now to Mara, who's going to moderate some conversation.
Thank you so much. So are we all gonna be on screen now together, or are we just? I'll just start, I guess. I actually wanted to start by asking, thank you so much, Golan. First of all, that was so beautiful and generative. And I kind of wanted to start, since you and Gregory both spoke so well to where queerness kind of manifests itself, or queer-friendly ethos manifests itself in Sendak's work, to ask Gregory to engage with the Oz fascination and think aloud a little bit about what's so appealing about those Oz books and inspiring.
You know, Mara, I can tell you're good at what you do, because you catch me at the weakest moment in my life as a gay man, which is that when Wicked first, when I first wrote Wicked, and people from the gay press began to call me for interviews and asked me about the gay content in Bomb and in MGM, my reply was, what are you talking about? What gay content? I was really, you know, screw loose up here. I didn't have the same sorts of opportunities to deconstruct stories that somebody who wasn't from a kind of immigrant ghetto might have had. In that way, again, I share a little bit with Sendak, sense of having been constrained not by a Jewish ghetto experience, but by a very severe Irish Catholic ghetto experience, where many things were not discussed, and where one had to almost invent the concepts oneself in order to understand them. So I was called disingenuous by Gay Community News and by Outright and whatever, but I wasn't disingenuous. I actually had to go back and think about it. I hadn't borrowed The Wizard of Oz in order to explore my own gay sensibility. I borrowed it for the architecture of good and evil, and how the green-skinned witch, the Margaret Hamilton character, was so clearly an avatar of evil that even Andy Warhol chose her as one of his American icons, as the Wicked Witch of the West. I can't help but, Golan, I have to jump in here about this though, because it is similar to what Sendak said about the end of The Wizard of Oz. This is going to sound like name droppiness, but I can't help it. I was on a conversation once in Pennsylvania with Salman Rushdie, and Salman Rushdie claimed that his career as a writer began with The Wizard of Oz, and I had a lot to say about that. And we were joking each other, but talking clearly about deconstructing that film from a child's point of view. And Salman Rushdie had written in a long essay about the film, published by the ICA in London, that the movie was perfect up until the last 2 minutes. And the last 2 minutes was so bad and so wrong that it almost ruined the entire rest of the movie. You basically watched the whole movie, and then you had to survive the last 2 minutes because it was such an affront. And because it broke so much from the original novel, in which Dorothy doesn't wake up from a conk in the head, but in the novel, she is deposited back on the canvas plains and runs home to find the house has been rebuilt because the house blew away. And it was not a dream, and it was not a fantasy. It was told as a story that had actually happened. And Salman Rushdie said, "What a mess, what a betrayal." And my response to him was that one of the things that the movie was saying, which was a different agenda than L. Frank Baum's particularly, was how untrustworthy the entire world of the adult hegemony was for a child of Dorothy's age. And that when Dorothy came home clearly from an adventure like nobody else, what did the adults do in the room? They did the same thing that the wizard had done, and that Glinda had done, and to some extent the Wicked Witch of the West had done. They lied to her. They said, this didn't happen. Get over it, get some therapy, we're going out for ice cream. It didn't happen, your life is not real. And so in that way, I actually convinced Salman Rushdie that the movie ending wasn't as tragically wrong as he had thought up until then. So Golan, when you talk about the image of the mother in Outside Over There being sequestered in the book, you answered a question I've always had about why that page was designed that way. And I'm really grateful for your keen eye and your clear interpretation of those sorts of correlations among great works.
And if I can I just add one thing, that it's interesting how that movie has, not only is it a touchstone for people across the world, but specifically for queer people, and Judy Garland, herself very much so. But I think there's something in that journey, and I think what you're saying, Gregory, is fascinating about The Lie. But when I was a kid, the way that I got through that last 2 minutes was by recognizing that they never lift the blanket off her feet. And so if they had lifted the blanket off her feet, she'd be wearing the ruby slippers, thus proving it was all true.
That's so funny. And I have to say, Gregory, you shouldn't feel bad about not recognizing the queer subtext of The Wizard of Oz, because critics have only recently begun to sort of talk about that. I'm thinking of like Tyson Pugh talks about the weird patchwork aesthetic of the Oz books, these queer creatures who are sort of part object, part man, part pumpkin, part boy, part girl, right? These crazy creatures. So yeah, there's a lot to say there. And Golan, I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about theatricality and campiness as a kind of queer motif that maybe ties some of this stuff together. Just because you could maybe say how theatricality sort of features in Sendak's work, and then Brian and Gregory can talk about their own experiences with the theatrical.
Absolutely, it's a really, I think, essential part of understanding Sendak. And of course, he had a second career, as he called it, in theater design, designing sets, opera, ballet, costumes, librettos. He really related to theater artists in general and to musicians. He sometimes wished that he had musical talents. He wished he was a musician. And Mozart, who we have in, I think, in Gregory's background as a bust there, was who he sometimes referred to as his biggest idol. I think that he used picture books. He described using picture books as a kind of tabletop theater, a context to stage the resourcefulness of children and their use of fantasy to survive overwhelming emotions, transforming the space of the picture book, much like a comic does or a comic book can do, using panels, expanding sizes of panels, breaking those panels open, as we see happening where the Wild Things are, where this large white panel shrinks and shrinks until the wild fantasy is overwhelming the whole page very theatrically. I think the most obvious example is Higgledy Piggledy Pop, which I have right here actually, that Gregory mentioned, where he's really creating this tabletop theater, as he's describing it, where the pages themselves are the proscenium arches. And really his work begins, I think, to do this most explicitly in The Sign on Rosie's Door in 1960, which spotlights a young child who in the streets of Brooklyn is entertaining her peers suffering from boredom by essentially performing, the way I interpret her is performing in a way that is similar to the art of drag, of really cobbling together various elements in her immediate surroundings to create a larger than life fantasy that enchants those who are kind of observing her and who are less inspired. And this leads to the CBS special that's so beloved, Really Rosie, where there's an even campier, more expressive theatrical version of Rosie, also drawing on some of the campier Jewish elements as well, singing about chicken soup, integrating characters from the Nutshell Library. So I think Sendak's theatricality draws on the one hand from his love of 1930s culture, the era of his childhood, the golden age of Hollywood and the popularization of comic books and the kind of speed and play that defined that era, the intermixing of highbrow and lowbrow forms. And then on the other hand, it really draws from a specific social and historical position. He's an insider-outsider. He's someone who is kind of forced by nature of who he is to pretend to be someone else much of his early life. he's not allowed to really grow up without becoming someone else or performing someone else. And that's a major concern of queer theory around childhood. As Catherine von Sochten describes it, this need to grow sideways instead of upward, or this ability to grow sideways through fantasy and theatricality as a way to survive the difficult emotions of what it might mean to be told you are not okay as you are, you must change or disappear if you want to grow up. So this, I think, is very much related to his relationship to theatricality and camp. And of course, camp is sometimes described as the heroism of those not called upon to be heroes. So I think that very much speaks to this notion of picking up from recycled elements and building heroism out of nothing, so to speak.
That was such a beautiful answer. And I love how you pick up on the motif of inside outside, which I felt like went all the way through the book in really beautiful ways. I have to also say that the peak of my own theatrical career came when I was 10 years old and I was Rosie and Really Rosie. With the boa, the hats, the flamboyant outfit. That was it. That was the peak for me. So I have great love for Rosie. Gregory and Brian, I wonder if you would talk about theatricality as it's featured in your own work or as something you appreciate in Sendak. And also, you've both had experiences, obviously, with your work being adapted into drama or filmic form. So Brian, will you maybe start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I actually wanted to be a set designer when I was in college. And I started off, I was an actor in high school and I acted in college, but I knew I didn't want to be a professional actor, but I enjoyed the world of the theater. And when I discovered set design, it was a perfect synthesis of everything that I loved because it involved drawing, it involved the theater, it involved telling stories. And I eventually made my way to children's books. And it took me a while, but children's books, it varied for, I mean, I had to discover this on my own. And I think that's what's so interesting about hearing about other people's life stories, especially someone who you come to idolize and know as deeply as we love Maurice, that even without knowing it, there are all of these parallel tracks that we have all gone on separately. You know, like all of our separate, you know, our individual loves for the Wizard of Oz. There we all are, you know, lonely kids sitting in our houses, not knowing that there's a world of people who have experienced what we are about to experience when we sit down to that movie for the first time. And so I love the fact that so much of the journey that I had to, and so many of us have to sort of blindly crawl our way through, is connected historically to so many other journeys. And so when I finally made my way to children's books, it was one of the thrills for me was realizing that it even more so for me brought together all of my love for the theater, because the way Golan so beautifully was describing what happens when the pictures change, the way, of course, those pictures change, going from white to the overarching wild rumpus, is by the physical act of turning the page of a book. You know, we can read ebooks, and I have nothing against that, and I love audiobooks, but you know, I think we all are united in our love of the physical book. And Golan was even talking about the joy of holding that physical book of his in his hand. And so Remy Charlap, who's another children's book writer and illustrator who was a mentor and friend of mine, wrote an essay called "The Page is a Door." And he talks about how the turning of the page is like the opening of a door or like the opening of a curtain on a stage. So every time the curtain rises, what is revealed is new, is surprising, could be a revelation. And so the idea that children's books themselves and the physical act of opening them and turning the pages are a theater in your hand when you're experiencing them.
Amazing.
I have a question for Brian, though, because you have escaped the gravitational pull of thinking of the picture book as a proscenium arch. I mean, I'll start with the famous image where Max is sailing across the ocean. He's in his private boat, and the sky and the water behind him looks like a painted stage set. It's painted in a different way than the art is drawn in the front, and his his face looking out at the audience, if you will, and the shadow on the yellow sail behind him is spotlit from, limelight coming up from about 6 feet away. It's all a certain focal depth that is very made for the stage. And so that, I think, reinforces what you're saying. But in order to survive our heroes, in order to escape their gravitational pull, you have to do something different. And in Hugo, you did do something different. And that, I think, is what Sendak was tipping his hat for you, because you took the mechanisms of the long pan and the close-up, and you gave us another way to enter a book that was not Sendak's way. It was the way you envisioned and found for yourself and gave to us. So I really salute you for that, because I think it's not easy to escape the pull of a genius.
Thank you, Gregory. Yeah, it's interesting. That's a whole other conversation, is escaping the pull of the genius you love.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that those illustrated sequences in Hugo Hugo was originally going to be a novella, like it was going to not be illustrated, like maybe one drawing a chapter. But then I began thinking about cinema, because the story itself is about cinema. But really, it was about thinking about what the cinema can do. But then what's ironic about what you're saying is that what I did in Hugo, I learned from the Wild Rumpus.
Yeah.
It's looking at the Wild Rumpus and thinking, what if that happens every 3 pages for 600 pages? If you like the Wild Rumpus,
Yeah,
now 600 pages.
Go big or go home.
This is amazing. Yeah, I was gonna sort of try and work in one of the questions from the chat.
Yeah.
Is that okay? But I don't want to preempt you, Gregory.
No,
okay.
No.
All right, so one of the questions in the chat from Albert Bitterman was about Sendak's ambivalence towards being conceived of as a children's writer. So I kind of wanted to ask Golan to talk about how Sendak was at once like really involved with actual children in his early career, but at the same time, sort of ambivalent about being thought of as a writer for children. So Golan, could you sort of tell us about that?
Absolutely. So there's definitely a seeming contradiction there that sometimes comes up when thinking about Sendak and the way he talked about children. Sometimes he's remembered as having loved all children and sometimes as having hated all children. And of course, neither of those is fully true. I think the contradiction comes from the difference in the way that childhood is understood or thought of. I think that Sendak hated being pegged as a children's writer or artist in the sense of what it meant at the time, or what it meant earlier to be. The way he perceived it in the wider culture. To be a children's writer, he thought, was to be constrained to this diminutive space where you write sweet, cute, silly things that don't mean very much and that don't have a lot of artistic merit. He loved children, especially sensitive, awake, creative children. And spoke to those children as he remembered his own childhood. He spoke from a place of his own inner child. And often talked about his work as being a means of exercising, with an O, getting rid of, exercising difficult emotions in himself from his childhood that made it difficult to grow up and become a person in the world. And so I think that connection is very kind of natural, the way that forms with other young readers who are frustrated with early developmental, emotional, social questions, struggles that they have about the world, not limited to children. Many of his readers were childless people in their 20s and 30s, especially for works later, like Outside Over There, published in '81. I think about a third of those sales or something like that were childless readers in their 20s or 30s. So he spoke to sensitive artists, which we find more often among children than among adults. The Picasso adage that every child is an artist and that only some of us survive, only some of us remain artists as we grow up. So I think that he was interested in that aspect of childhood, but not in this cultural category of childness that was being confined to this very diminutive space. But you're right that at the beginning of his career, especially, he was very much involved with direct observation of children. The Bank Street School was where Ruth Krauss collected children's definitions on note cards, and those definitions became the text for A Hole Is to Dig, which Sendak illustrated. So he really was interested in the rhythms of actual childhood, and of course observing Rosie, this Sicilian immigrant child in his largely Jewish and Sicilian neighborhood growing up in Brooklyn. But it was the aspect that spoke to his own child self, his own more creative, artistic, sensitive child self that sometimes gets socialized out of us as we grow up.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm so glad you mentioned Krauss, such an important mentor to Sendak, and you write about her so beautifully, and Philip Nell writes about her so beautifully in his biography of Krauss. So thank you for that. Gregory, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sense of this issue, about whether you think of yourself as a writer for children and or not, you know.
There's something valid and useful about little by little becoming the senior member on any panel. and that is that I have been able to give up worrying about what other people want to call me, however they want to call me. I don't care anymore. And I've sort of have come around to saying the books that I write for the last almost 20 years are books for people who like to read Gregory Maguire books. And I really don't care who they're published. The last 3 books that I submitted, one to Caldecott, my children's book publisher, and 2 to HarperCollins, my adult book publisher. In all 3 instances, I said, this may not be for you. It may not be what you want. If you don't want it, don't worry, I'll send it to the other publisher. Meaning I wouldn't change a word. You can publish it as a children's book, as a YA book, as an adult book. I don't care. They have never yet rejected them, but they will one day, I'm sure. But I like being able to slip those particular bonds. And indeed, I think the success of books like Wicked, not only Wicked, but like Wicked, have helped loosen publishers up to say, it isn't as important as it was. Golan, you would be able to tell us, I think perhaps you did in your book, I think Outside Over There was perhaps advertised in both children's and adult sections of the Harper catalog that particular season. Is that correct?
I believe so. That detail is escaping me, but I know that at least the sales were reflective of that, but I think you're right.
Yeah, and that's how it should be. I mean, when I was about in 7th grade, I went back and forth happily between getting books out again that I had loved reading when I was in 4th grade, and then beginning my adult books. I'd have everything in some picture books because I liked pictures. I'd put everything on the same pile and bring it all home and go through it as a voracious reader. And that, I think, is a healthy and perhaps lucky way to go about it.
But and my sense is that Maurice was just doing his work, right? Like he was telling the stories he needed to tell, and most of the people who wanted to read his work were children, all right? And like there was a sense that was who the audience would be. So I don't think it was that he didn't want to be a children's book illustrator. I think it was more a recognition that children are dismissed. They're dismissed culturally. What is important for them is dismissed by the larger public, or so many people in the quote unquote adult art or literature world. They're dismissed. And of course, the people who Maurice most loved, the other people beyond Mozart himself, were generally artists who were dismissed, like Melville and Van Gogh and Emily Dickinson, and even Keats. Like, these were the people who he, in a way, most identified with. Like, when I would talk to him about those people who he loved, and he had, John Keats's death mask by his bed, it wasn't like he was talking about people who he admired. It was like listening to Gregory talk about Maurice. It was like they were living people who he knew. And so I think that is more the gets to Mr. Bitterman's question about the paradox. And then Maurice did branch out more, and do work like the theater work and some adult books as well.
Yeah, Pete Kunze has a quick question about Eugene Glynn and Sendak's own interest in psychoanalysis and also his works for adults. So Golan, do you want to tackle some of that?
Sure, yeah, so Eugene Glynn was Sendak's partner of over 50 years. They met in Manhattan at a social group where Gene played the piano. Eugene was a really successful psychoanalyst, psychiatrist who worked in public institutions, and also an art critic. And the two of them cultivated a beautiful lifestyle together, sometimes living apart for periods and together at various times of their lives, between New York City and Ridgefield, Connecticut, where Sendak and Eugene moved out in 1972. But Jonathan Weinberg writes about, in his book, Desperate Necessities, collection of Eugene Glenn's essays, that though Eugene never directly wrote about Sendak, he was in some ways always writing about him, in the sense that he was trying to understand the creative process as that relates to a person's psychology, what it means to be a creative individual working through one's own inner world, inner trauma. And in terms of the later work, I think that it's important also to note the some have mentioned that Sendak's My Brother's book, which was published posthumously, which is about his brother, some have suggested that there are shared elements with his mourning of Eugene Glenn, who died in 2007. Sendak was also creating Bumble Artie as Eugene was dying of lung cancer, which is it's a book, Bumble Artie, about a young pig, actually, who's not allowed to have a birthday party. He promises never to turn 10, but he ends up throwing this secret party of all these different flamboyant guests from different cultures and time periods. And it's kind of a wonderful expression of subversive theatricality in play. And it's a book that he says that Sendak says kind of helped save him as he was grieving, as his partner was passing away. So those are a couple of pieces that I guess I would share.
Beautiful. And I would just urge everyone to buy Golan's book, because there's so much in it about that aspect and about the wonderful activism that Sendak engaged in, AIDS activism, to try and support people living with AIDS and all kinds of amazing things. And it's killing me that I have to turn this over now, because I feel like we could go on for another hour, but I will turn things over to Ilana to wrap up now. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ilana McQuinn. I'm the program coordinator with the Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here with us, joining us from across many time zones, and our moderator, Maguire, as well as all of you for being with us right now. And for all of your great questions. If you want to learn more, you can. I dropped in the chat. You can get 20% off Dr. Moskowitz's book with the code Visionary20 at Stanford University Press. I'd also like to tell you guys about some of our next events. Our next event will be April 22nd at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'm dropping a link into the chat. This is Black but or Jewish, a conversation on intersections within and across communities. You can read more at the link there. I'd also like to invite you to connect with us. We have a number of ways that you can do that. You can find us on our website, on Facebook at Grant Center for the American Jewish Experience, on Twitter and Instagram at Grant Center TU. And also, please do let us know if you want to be added to our events list. You can contact us at Grant Center at tulane.edu if you want to be added to our email events list. So thank you very much to you all for attending, for the panelists for being here, and for the events team who helped us put this all together.